today. I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction before we get into it, but I'm glad that you could join us. My name is Chris Diggs. I am one of the alums who is on the leadership team of the Lehigh Alumni Pride Association. And I wanted to just tell you a little bit about who we are as a group and how we've sort of gotten teed up for events like the one we have happening today. So LAPA is one of Lehigh's affinity groups for alums across the Lehigh community, particularly for LGBTQ identified alums as well as allies. We serve as a point of connection for alums through communications and events, sometimes more recently virtually like this, oftentimes also as part of some of Lehigh's main events like Reunion and Lehigh Laugh. And we also host our own in-person smaller regional gatherings and other ways to celebrate and connect throughout the year. We also are very involved in supporting the work of Lehigh's Pride Center, which is the space on campus for current students who are members of the LGBTQ community, providing opportunities for alums and students to build connections with one another, to provide support for their work and fundraising efforts, and to stay connected to things that are happening in the Lehigh community. We are thrilled to kick off Pride Month today with our first co-hosted Mountain Talk and wish you a celebratory and action-oriented Pride in 2021. We have made great strides at Lehigh and beyond, but always know that there is more work to be done and that we do that work on the shoulders of the kind of work and people that we're going to be hearing about today. We hope that you'll stay connected with us and we'll share, and there are many ways to do that with us through the link in the chat. We have a fairly active, if not a little old school, Facebook group, and as well as frequent email communications, but not too frequent. And would love to stay in touch with you through the Lehigh Alumni Office, as well as through our own efforts. And so I look forward to hearing and listening with all of you today for today's chat and staying connected to you after today. So with that, I'll turn things over to Jennifer, who's going to introduce our presenter today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP of Alumni Relations at Lehigh and the host of today's Mountain Talk, which again, thank you to LAPA and to Chris for partnering with us on this. So Dr. Mary Foltz is an associate professor of English and faculty in the Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department at Lehigh, and she's also the director of the Southside Initiative. She's going to talk with us for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to ask her questions. The way you're going to ask those questions is to put them in the chat, and I will read them aloud to Mary so that she can focus on answering your questions and not scrolling through trying to find the questions. We are recording. I think I am legally bound to tell you that. We also have today live transcript, which is available, which is something that we didn't know that we had access to. But if you are having trouble hearing us or just want to read along, go to the bottom of your screen and click live transcript, and you have a few options there to see what we're saying. So I will kick it off to Dr. Foltz.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you so much, Chris. Happy Pride, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to do the Mountain Talk for this month. Again, my name is Mary Foltz, and as Jennifer stated, I'm an associate professor of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and I also direct the Southside Initiative. Before discussing my work with the Lehigh Valley LGBT Community Archive, I want to talk about some larger questions that really animate my research in local LGBT history. And here are some questions that I'm constantly kind of engaging with. Why do regional LGBTQ archives matter? What is the import of local LGBTQ historical understanding? And what role do archives play in producing historical narratives about local communities? To answer these questions, I want you to think about major leaders, major organizations, and major events that you might associate with LGBTQ history. And if we were in person, I would just have you shout out any figure that matters to you or a specific event or organization. But since we're here on Zoom, I'm gonna kind of imagine what some of you might be thinking. So in terms of events, you might think about Stonewall, a major uprising in 1969 in New York City as trans people, gays and lesbians rioted against police violence against LGBTQ people. Or you might think about the Compton Cafeteria riot in San Francisco in 1966. Susan Stryker, one of the most important trans theorists, has a great film about that event. So maybe you're thinking about that. Or you might be thinking about infamous AIDS activism in New York City, especially through organizations like ACT UP. Or perhaps you're thinking more federally focused about marches in Washington, DC, and national organizations like the Human Rights Campaign or NGLTF. In terms of LGBTQ leaders, you might think about Harvey Milk and his political work in San Francisco, or Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera in New York City and their transformative activism with STAR in the wake of Stonewall. Recent films have really allowed us access to those figures. I mention these here because what these historical events and leaders share is that their stories are drawn from major metropolises on the East and West Coast, seemingly confirming that LGBTQ history and activism occurs primarily in major urban centers. And if we move past a focus on actual historical events and leaders and turn to major media representations of LGBTQ communities, we might also argue that popular shows like Pose, The L Word, Transparent, and even Will and Grace also emphasize coastal metropolises as the central places of LGBTQ politics and culture, as they overwhelmingly seem to focus on LA, San Francisco, and New York. And certainly we could think of exceptions to this rule. Queer as Folk is supposed to be set in Pittsburgh, even though it was filmed mostly in Toronto. But I would argue that most of the celebrated accounts of LGBTQ history and culture tend to center coastal major urban centers. This is also the case when we think about sites for archival collection for LGBTQ communities. The Lesbian Her Story Archives, the One Archives, the GLBT Historical Society, to name just 3 major organizations. These cities offer vibrant exhibitions in LA and New York, and they're built from priceless archival materials that both draw upon unique civic histories and contribute to broad national historical understandings of liberation movements and activism. So for communities like ours, like the Lehigh Valley, outside of these major urban centers, archives and exhibits in New York and LA can be important destinations, even as they seemingly confirm that LGBTQ history happens elsewhere in coastal metropolises far from us. But of course, national movements depend upon regional activists to engage with the political platforms of leading organizations, to fight for LGBTQ causes at local levels, and to struggle for social change within our specific cultural milieus. In short, there is no national movement without regional activists who have unique stories to tell about LGBTQ history. And yet too frequently, regional LGBTQ history is not a major focus either in university curricula or for local nonprofit organizations as they provide essential direct services to our communities. A number of scholars, including Diane K. Wakamoto, argue that historians need to focus more attention on LGBTQ activism, cultural production, and community formations outside of New York City and San Francisco. And in their work, they argue that archives in small urban centers, and I'm quoting here, provide new geographic focus for community archives research, thereby correcting and expanding our understanding of LGBTQ history. So this is the first reason that I want to highlight in my opening comments about the first sort of rationale for the value of regional LGBTQ archives. They give us the opportunity to reflect upon the relationship between political work in major urban centers and smaller urban communities and also rural communities. They showcase the unique strategies that small urban centers and rural communities have used as they address the specific challenges within our region. And community archives allow us to honor and to celebrate regional figures who have transformed our cities and our state, contributing powerfully to progressive political movements. So the Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Allentown, PA, created the Lehigh Valley LGBT Community Archives in 2016. Because this organization recognized the import of regional history in order to provide more nuanced accounts of how regions like our own in the Lehigh Valley contribute to national movements for equity. And over the past 3 years, I have partnered with Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center to expand and activate their archives for public audiences. And I've supported their goal of connecting local history to national movement building. With funding from the Southside Initiative and the Office for Creative Inquiry, I have led graduate student and undergraduate student teams in the creation of 2 traveling exhibitions, which I'll show you in a minute. And I've also led 2 separate oral history projects, one of which focuses on the life stories of LGBTQ elders in the Lehigh Valley, and the other focuses upon collecting the life stories of trans people broadly and queer and trans people of color in the Lehigh Valley. And finally, I was recently awarded the ACLS Scholars in Society Fellowship. And with this fellowship in the next year, I will work with Bradbury Sullivan Community Center to produce dynamic social media, including videos about archival materials. I'm going to help them expand their collections. Right now they have 22 collections, so I'm going to help them expand that. And I'm going to help them produce a large exhibit about regional LGBTQ history. So I'm going to show you just a few portions of these traveling exhibits in a minute, and I just want to briefly discuss why these projects matter for Lehigh students who really have been at the center of archival teams that were building exhibitions. So as you may know, LGBTQ students at Lehigh tend to be quite separate from LGBTQ communities off campus. And some students are really not even aware that there is a thriving and really vibrant LGBTQ community off campus. So archival projects like the ones I'm going to show you in a minute give students the opportunity to engage with larger Lehigh Valley communities. And I think importantly also, LGBTQ students have many different majors at Lehigh and often do not have the opportunity to learn about our community's histories in their coursework at Lehigh. They might be able to take 1 or 2 classes here or there, but major requirements might not allow them to study in that area as much as they want. So summer archival projects give students the opportunity to explore recent LGBTQ history, from the homophile movement to the gay liberation movement to AIDS activism, trans liberation, the fight for marriage equality, and a variety of other issues, including Black Lives Matter, which has been really important, is led by queer people in the Lehigh Valley in our own Black Lives Matter organization, which is Justin Parker. For students, archival projects both give them access to local communities in the present and deep engagement with LGBTQ history. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to show you just a little bit from 2 of our traveling exhibitions that students and I created over the past 2 years. So just give me 1 second here. Okay, so here these are some of the projects that I just mentioned in my opening comments. And here's the opening panel for an exhibit that traveled to Bradbury Sullivan Community Center. It was shown at Lehigh. It also traveled to Muhlenberg College, but then due to COVID, it was hard for people to come out and see it. The exhibit was called Pride Guides and the Early Years of Lehigh Valley Pride Festivals. And it really focused on giving a history for how Pride festivals came to the Lehigh Valley. And they were created directly following the 1993 March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation. That took place in 1993. And a cohort from the Lehigh Valley traveled to Washington, D.C. for this march. And when they came home, they brought back the whole sort of platform for that march and said, we need to build something in the Lehigh Valley here that brings our community together to talk politics, to talk about LGBTQ health, to really have an annual rallying place. And they just started the Pride Festival. The first year, 1,000 participants came out. So it was a huge success, even in its first year. And in this panel, you can see this is a timeline for the first decade of Pride festivals. It grew to 2,000 people showed up the next year. The big political issue was the PA hate crimes bill and the Federal Employment Non-Discrimination Act, also known as ENDA. And these were big topics that people were talking about at Pride. Now, does that mean that people were not also partying at Pride? No, there was lots of partying at Pride, but there was also this sort of political undercurrent, as there frequently is. And then from there, you really get the idea that the festival just built and built and built from 1,000 to 4,000 people by 1997 to what we have today in the Lehigh Valley. And this year, Pride in the Lehigh Valley will be in person. It was just announced today. So this exhibit really gave a history for the development of those festivals. On other panels, here's the kind of completion of the timeline. On other panels, we focused on the major topics that were addressed in Pride Guides, which were produced for each festival. And I guess I should give a little information here. If you go to Pride today, you don't always find a Pride Guide, but in the early years of Pride festivals in New York City, San Francisco, even Seattle, which is where I'm from, every festival had a publication that came with it. And it certainly had all of the performers and all of the events, it listed vendors, et cetera. But it also was a place for short articles to be produced about major health issues or major political battles. So Pride Guides became the annual publication that was keeping a larger LGBTQ community up to date with things that we really cared about. So we created side panels in this exhibition to talk about major themes that appeared in the Pride Guides. So health was a major issue. And of course, there was a lot of focus in the still in the 90s on AIDS activism, healthcare issues, how to find healthcare providers. So there's a lot of focus on health. Many of the Pride Guides helped us remember people we had lost in the past year. So we created a panel on remembrance. We talked about the politics, including the sort of Pennsylvania state politics that Pride Guides addressed. And we talked about all the people that get together to make Pride happen. Our second exhibit, which is actually traveling this year, is called Pride in Print, Moving Above Ground and Embracing Our Gaydar. And this exhibit focuses on two regional LGBTQ publications. One was called Above Ground and the other was called Gaydar. They were produced in the 1990s for Above Ground, and Gaydar really lasted from the late 1990s into the 21st century. Regional media really matters for LGBTQ communities because too frequently our mainstream newspapers aren't necessarily centering the kinds of issues that matter to our communities. So LGBTQ produced regional publications keep our community apprised of things that we should care about. And both of the editors for these journals really did focus on, creating publications that could address things that our communities care about. And I'll just give an example here. Above Ground was produced by a man named Mitch Hempel. He was a bartender at Stonewall. I don't know if any of you were able to go to Stonewall. It just closed like 2 days ago, I think. That was had been around forever. So it's so sad to see that gay bar close in the Lehigh Valley. But Mitch Hempel started this publication because we didn't have one at the time in 1994. And there was so much happening in terms of AIDS activism in the Lehigh Valley, so much happening around hate crimes legislation. He just felt like, look, I got to start one. I have to start this publication. And so he created Above Ground. And he really focused on activists and political organizations that weren't getting the press they needed in mainstream media. And Gaydar magazine, as you can tell from the covers of these magazine covers, was more of an infotainment kind of publication, really focused on gay men, although they also addressed bisexual people, trans people, and lesbians to a lesser extent. And it also did focus on regional politics like hate crimes legislation. So each panel from this exhibit allows our people that attend our exhibit to kind of understand how these publications really highlighted issues that matter to LGBTQ people. Here we have a panel on a really important civic ordinance. It was the expansion of the anti-discrimination ordinance in Allentown to include LGBTQ people. That was a fight in the 90s. And in 2002, they were able to expand that anti-discrimination ordinance in Allentown. So we tell some really local stories, even as we address how we tie to national debates. I have some clips from an oral history project, which I'd be happy to share, Jennifer, but I think that's probably enough out of me just to start our conversation. So I'll just say thank you so much for allowing me to share some of our work in the regional archives, and I really look forward to your questions.
Great. Yeah, so to ask questions, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Put them in the chat, and I will read them out loud to Mary. One question I had while people are thinking of their questions, for the archives, who are the targets for those? Is it the whole community? Are you mainly advertising that these exist to the LGBTQ community, or who do you have in mind when you're crafting these?
Yeah, so when Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center is building the archives, it was really important to them that they were community owned. So the archives are actually at Muhlenberg College, and they were created in partnership with Muhlenberg College. However, Bradbury Sullivan Community Center maintains ownership of the archives, and that was really important to them because if they wanted to move the archives, they can at any time. So Muhlenberg gives them a safe space. So it's like archival quality preservation and processing, and that's really important. But it really is the community's archives. You know, having said that, one of the difficulties with archives is that, you know, community members might find it really difficult to even go to Muhlenberg you know, just feel comfortable enough to go into the library or feel like they own those archives. So digitization has been really important to grant community members access. So you could just go online, and you all can go online too and just type in Lehigh Valley Community Archives and it'll come up under Trexler Library at Muhlenberg. I think one of the issues, Jennifer, to kind of move in a different direction with your question that I think students at Lehigh and that I've been really invested in is making exhibitions or publishing public-facing pieces about the archives. Mm-hmm. It's difficult for community members who might not want to read, you know, 40 journal issues from the 1990s or not have the time to do that. So if we can create an exhibition that really is accessible and exciting, it creates greater community engagement with archival materials. And so I think in this next year, that was my whole grant application for this upcoming fellowship, you know, granting greater access through creating social media, just a short clip about an archival object and what it means. Like that kind of stuff allows for greater community engagement with archives. So we have a lot of work to do around that. It's not just about collecting. We have to make accessible pathways for community members to access that history.
Right. Scott's question, he says, thank you, Dr. Foltz. Can you share a bit about if or how archival work can inform future activists and movement efforts?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Scott, so much for this question. I'm so glad you're here today, Scott. I think this is such an essential question. You know, Bradbury Sullivan just completed an oral history project about, it's called 40 Years of LGBTQ Health from HIV/AIDS to COVID. And the whole collection is our elders thinking about living through the early years of HIV/AIDS, all of the things that they did in the absence of federal and state government action in those early years. They created hospices. They created community organizations in the Lehigh Valley to care for people. One of the most important ones was called FACT, which stood for Fighting AIDS Continuously Together. It's just beautiful. But that organization became an advocacy organization. It helped people that were struggling. So for example, HIV positive people that had lost employment, if they needed a tire repair on their car or a drive to the doctor, they needed someone to help feed them or care for them. FACT and other AIDS organizations in the Lehigh Valley did that work. What they were communicating in that oral history project in light of COVID was the absolute import of building robust, local, hyper-local community organizations that can care for the most vulnerable members of our communities. And a second thing that those organizations did is they were incredibly coalitional. So the Latinx community in the Lehigh Valley was really hit hard by HIV/AIDS in the early years. And a lot of LGBTQ organizations that also clearly would include Latinx people were partnering with organizations that hadn't centered LGBTQ people in the Latinx communities. And so that coalitional work became incredibly important in the early years of HIV/AIDS. Really embracing LGBTQ communities, but also thinking about, people that were using, drug addicts that were getting HIV/AIDS that maybe weren't LGBTQ. They were expanding out, making connections with Latinx community leaders, et cetera. That has been, really important. So I think, Scott, just to answer your question quickly, for me, it's the organizational structural piece that our elders in our community can share with younger community members. And because these organizations depend so much on volunteer labor, if we do not have an archive that captures their stories, that intergenerational communication can get lost. And in the absence of that intergenerational communication, when bars close, like Stonewall, that's a place for intergenerational communication, archives can become a central hub for sharing all of that organizational information that may be useful as we fight public health challenges today. And of course, as we continue to address HIV and AIDS today. I hope that answers your question, Scott.
I have one comment from Lewis and then a question from one of your former students. So Lewis Allegra is a volunteer mentor and DEI advocate for SCORE, Lehigh Valley. They help small businesses. He says he's interested in learning about obstacles that LGBTQ people face when they're trying to launch or grow businesses. So he's interested in helping, and his information is here. The question is from Janelle Pham. She says, hi, Mary, you were one of my master's thesis readers way back in 2011. Chair was Tanya Saunders. It's so great to see you again. So great to see the work you've been up to. How much do you think the LGBTQ community in the Lehigh Valley benefited from its proximity to larger cities with vibrant organizations such as Philly or New York? And what kinds of issues, if any, do you think were unique to the Lehigh Valley community? And I do have to point out, we only have a couple minutes left. So this will be the last question. Very, very good one to end on.
Lewis, I'll just say for your comment, the place to go is Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center. And I know they have people working with LGBTQ businesses, and they're really active. They just got an award, I think, from the Lehigh Valley Business, some kind of business award. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact name, but that's where to go for information. And I'm happy to send you an email with their information. Janelle, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for coming out, and thank you for this wonderful question. Quickly, the Lehigh Valley did benefit from our proximity to New York City. For example, when the Homophile organization, which was called Lehigh Homophile Organization, I want a t-shirt that says that, Lehigh Ho on it, which I think would also be funny, but also like historical. Lehigh Ho got their whole list of members by contacting the Mattachine Society in New York City. That's how they did it. And at that time, they just gave them the mailing list. They didn't give them the names of people, but the mailing list, so they could send out materials. And that's how they got membership in 1969, was through a New York City contact. And a lot of our community members, for example, we have community members that were driving to Stonewall the night that protestation of police brutality and surveillance took place in 1969. They were in those bars. We have oral histories with some of those community members. So there was a great connection between New York City and Philadelphia. And a lot of our local activists were going in for different kinds of protests and then bringing information and knowledge back to our communities. Now, having said that, the Lehigh Valley is very different than New York City. You know, we had some very conservative Democratic city council people in Allentown throughout the 70s and 80s. We're surrounded by rural communities. We've got a Pennsylvania Dutch, we've got Mennonite communities surrounding us. So not all of the strategies that activists were using in New York City really were useful necessarily here. And so a lot of what we're uncovering is the unique strategies that LGBTQ activists used in our region that could both build and bring in tactics from New York City and Philly, but also really were homegrown. My favorite story in this vein, and then I'll end, and Janelle, if you want to email me, I'm happy to talk about this more. But two of our really important activists in the region were Mennonites, and they were a straight couple. The Kreiders, and Roberta Kreider had a family member who died of AIDS, and she became an incredibly important activist. And it was important for LGBTQ people in the Lehigh Valley, where you know, Christianity has been so important in this region, to have religious leaders who would come out and, you know, fight homophobia and transphobia. And so there were lots of partnerships. The Episcopal Church was really involved in AIDS care in the early years of the AIDS epidemic in the Lehigh Valley. They created healing services that hundreds of people came out to. So there's a kind of religious, progressive religious connections and activism here that is a really kind of unique story about how activists built bridges and coalitions in order to, you know, to create support, both in terms of legislation, but to influence healthcare organizations during the early years of AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, to support our community and to lobby for, you know, for legislation that would benefit our community, including inclusive healthcare, et cetera. So there are really unique stories here. I mean, New York City is not going to talk about Mennonites, who were an important part of the LGBTQ activism, but we have some really unique stories here that I think our archives can contribute both to our regional understanding of LGBTQ history, but then kind of correcting histories that only focus on metropolises. You know, smaller regions like ours are really a large part of progressive movements. We deserve our day in the sun, and for those stories to really transform what we think we know about LGBTQ history. Thank you so much, Janelle.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary. This is really interesting and educational, and we can send out you know, how people can go visit the archives and see it online in our follow-up, and also give you people's email addresses for you to continue the conversation. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great Pride Month, and we'll see you again soon.